The Kevin Durant and Joe Tsai meeting did officially go down, and the fallout from it is not going to be pretty from a Brooklyn Nets fan perspective. One, Kevin Durant remains entrenched in his trade request, and the other side of that coin is creating an even further divide inside of this organization. We break it all down next.
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Yes, it is the Locked On Nets podcast right here on the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team, the Brooklyn Nets, every single day. Over there, you're going to find Doug Norrie, owner-operator DFSR, for all your daily fantasy sports rankings from DraftKings to FanDuel, with the NFL right around the corner and MLB steamrolling along. He's got you covered. I'm Adam Arbuck, breaking down the New York Football Giants on the One Giant podcast with my boy Andy Mack. We thank you for making us your first listen of the day, free on all those great platforms. And Doug, boy, I tell you, we'll make jokes about what we had planned for today's episode somewhere along the way. But in the meantime, Shams Charania, obviously a voice for the players, typically when it comes to NBA coverage. The article inside of The Athletic basically outlining that rumored meeting between Kevin Durant and Joe Tsai officially did go down in London. And guess what? It's not good news.
No, it's not great. Anyone that was part of hashtag Team Run It Back has to be a little concerned now with the although I will say Kevin Durant did at least leave the door open for that. It's going to take another huge thing to have happen here. So not totally off the table. But yeah, Durant, the word out of the meeting with Tsai, which we were kind of waiting on to see if there would be any specifics that came out of that. We've assumed at some point there would be, if there was good or bad or indifferent. But it seems that Kevin Durant has not only reiterated the trade request, but also threw in a little caveat that we have not heard before, which makes sense, I guess, a little in context, if not in practice, is that he has also said it's kind of the reason I want out is you need to choose between me, Kevin Durant, or the Sean Marks, Steve Nash regime, probably more focused on Marks than Nash. And this is like the one final piece of the puzzle that makes you very worried / like it's unclear how this resolves now, short of him being traded, because this was the one piece that I guess was being held from everybody else, was that while assumed that the two sides were at odds, because why else do you want out if you don't, if everything's great? So that's obvious. But that had never really been said publicly until now. And now it's been said publicly that said it's me or them. And we can talk about all the things that it means, but it's obviously terrible news if you're in the side where that you held out hope about Durant coming back. Although maybe it just takes, maybe you think that Mark's getting fired is worth it. I don't know. We can talk about that, but this is the new wrinkle to the whole saga.
Yeah, and by the way, we had talked a few episodes ago about how we gave our final predictions on how we thought this would unfold. We also said, as news breaks, we're going to cover, whatever the new updates are. I think, if we go back to those, we can revisit that too around our predictions. I'm feeling a little bit more bullish on mine, maybe now at this point than I did even at the time. I know it's obvious. This is obviously terrible. So we could sit here for a few minutes and talk about how bad it is that this ends up being what you get out of this conversation. But to your point, I'm going to go in somewhat quickly on this, and I don't think this is going to curry me any favor with the Nets fan base. But I will say, if you're Kevin Durant and you go in for this face-to-face meeting after having submitted your trade request, where it was somewhat assumed that one of your biggest gripes was probably with the front office and with Sean Marks, and it was probably assumed for Joe Tsai, if not already expressed at the time of the trade request, that he has an issue with Sean Marks, and maybe with Steve Nash to that extent too. That was already kind of known that you had problems here, and Joe Tsai seems to have already made his commitment at a minimum to Sean Marks, and it looks like, at least in the short term, to Steve Nash. So I don't know what this coming to the table and saying, hey, I still want my trade request, and the only difference would be if you fire Sean Marks and Steve Nash. it just seems odd. It seems like an odd thing to come to that table, shy of making it public through Shams Charania, as I said at the top, a player narrative reporter, and that's not a negative. He usually is plugged into how the players are feeling about things. That's what it feels like. Is I'm going to make this also a public component of it that maybe does help with perception around you submitted a trade request. Now it's clear it's because you have a divide with the organization, not simply maybe you'd prefer to play somewhere else and you just like a better odds, whatever the case may be.
Yeah, I actually just think it's that. I think that it's the only new news is that it's available for everybody now. I think this has been, I think that's really the only piece of, I don't think this was the first time that this was, intimated to Tsai on this side, which is why he came out in favor of, heavily in favor of the Nets brass, sort of last time there was public comments about it. I think here it's just, hey, I'm going to make the fan, I'm going to sow a little more discord on the way, or I'm going to really, this is my next, whenever you're negotiating something or whenever you are, trying to get something out of a situation, we'll call this a negotiation because in some ways it is. You don't do everything. Usually you don't go scorched earth to start. Like there's no reason to take there's no reason to take 10 Advil if one will do, right? Like if you
burn everything down, there's nothing left to come back and burn.
Right. This is why, there's last resort measures. This is not the last resort, by the way. Like last resort is sitting out and things like that. And really, those are, a one-man strike and stuff like that. There are other places to go with this. This is just a ramping up of the narrative around how badly I want this so that everyone else is clear. Like, hey, maybe in his eyes, it's like, I tried to make this easy. I'm going to put that in quotes. I tried to make this easy. I put in a trade request. It's not happening because you have, unrealistic, goals about getting what something
because you value me too highly.
Right. Exactly. It's all crazy. I can't believe we're talking about this. Like, but then you don't do everything right. Like you don't pit yourself against your organization first if you're just going to get traded. Because why sow negativity when you don't need to? But when it doesn't look like it's going to happen, and the organization is just kind of standing pat and not accepting any deals, then you have to take the next step. And the next step is letting everyone, I'm sure from Kevin Durant's eyes, in terms of letting this be made public, letting him know, hey, just in case there was any confusion, I don't want to play for these two guys anymore. The GM and the coach, I don't want to play for them anymore. And that's just it. So you can have me back, Nets owner or Nets fans, like by proxy, but it's going to take these other guys. And that forces some really hard decisions. Like that forces some really hard decisions about what you do organizationally, and I think that's what it is. I think so. Just a long-windedly reply to what you were saying. I don't think this is news to anybody except that it's now been memorialized as part of the request.
Yeah, I know, and I think that makes sense and it's fair. It puts it into the public landscape. The one thing I guess, if everyone knew it, because the last thing I was going to say before we get into the decision of that he has presented to Joe Tsai and now more publicly, and whether or not this is going to influence what happens for the Brooklyn Nets and some other components to it that led up to this sentiment that he may have around the organization. But if this was understood, I guess there's no world where this is now damaging the market. And maybe in hindsight, something we don't need to dive in too much in this episode would be, why were they not getting more seismic packages? If it was all along understood, there is a rift between Kevin Durant and the organization to the point where there is no coming back to the table. There is no he's going to play this season. He would sit out for training camp or into the regular season. If other organizations have a sense of that, then there's no reason for them to overextend themselves in the packages they're going to offer.
Yeah, of course. And like this, I would contend this doesn't make trading him easier. If you're going to try to retain full value, other teams might try to come to the table with lower offers because now it's hard to ask for the moon when this is the case. Like we know the more, the more a player is upset by something, or the more they're dug their heels in about being let out of a contract or being traded, let's say, it doesn't always make it the situation easier. In fact, it sometimes puts pressure on the organization just to make it happen, to just get rid of this talking point, to get it out, just to be done with it, right? Like there could be a situation where you just need to be done with it. Some teams have stayed the course on this and still asked for the moon. They got a ton for Davis. You know what I mean? Like there's been situations where a player was dug in, but not always. Kawhi came back with DeRozan. Look, there was a bunch of question marks on that one too. So I don't know if it actually changes the trade landscape as much as it does pit. I kind of never felt it was an us against them thing, even through all this. And now it just clearly is, right? It's like me versus them versus me. I'm not coming back. I'm not playing for these guys. I'm very clear. Whether this is a reasonable request or not, like we're going to talk about that in a second. But because I think there's other layers to this that are kind of in some ways hilarious. But just from a talking point standpoint, this is just the next level of here's what I'm willing to say or do to make sure that there's no confusion. Like, I don't want to be here with these guys. So we'll get into some of the more of this because there's a bunch of layers to this, and it's just going to lead into what we were going to talk about originally on this episode, which was stuff that we would have changed over the course of the Nets timeline here. We're going to get into all that here in a second. First, got to talk to you about our friends over at Built Bar. Have you gotten on the Built Bar Puffs yet? If not, you're depriving yourself of one of life's great joys. They got the new flavor out there, the cookie dough chunk puff, 100% covered in real chocolate, light and chewy texture, made with those real cookie dough chunks. And you know that they're going to be good for you as well. 160 calories, 15 grams of protein. If you're a fan of the cookie dough ice cream, you know you like having those chunks in there. The cookie dough puff recreates it for you, and they make sure it's healthy. Like I said, 100% covered in chocolate, super tasty, good for you. And they got that light, fluffy texture that you know comes with the Built Puffs. Go to Built.com. Use the promo code LOCKED15 to get 15% off of your order. Use promo code LOCKED15 for 15% off at Built.com.
So Kevin Durant remains committed to the trade request. And this is, I think, where it becomes interesting and where I thought I'm not going to, again, I know if you are a fan of the player, Kevin Durant, and if you are a player first type of fan around the NBA, you're going to be disgusted with the way I present this conversation now. And you mentioned some of the talking points around changes that we might make. To say that you don't, for Kevin Durant to say, I don't like the direction that the organization is going in, or I don't trust the organization, the direction it's going, completely removes you, Kevin Durant, from being a part of the equation of how we came to this point as an organization. Kyrie Irving was signed here first. That brought you here. There are several things Kyrie Irving was a part of these in a lot of ways too. But the signing of DeAndre Jordan, the money that you allocated to him, how it then created issues around playing time for Jared Allen and his development, how it then created issues with having Kenny Atkinson as the head coach because he wanted to play Jared Allen, how that then was the impetus to get rid of him and bring in Steve Nash, someone that Kyrie Irving said, I like it. I want this guy in. And Sean Marks also had connections to. And that's the tip of the iceberg, because as we've always said, and rightfully so, superstars should be involved and should be considered in the decisions that an organization makes. But now at this point, where we feel like, okay, Sean Marks, Joe Tsai, the organization said, we need to try to regather some of our control of our organization and make that proverbial line in the sand around what we're willing to do for our superstars. It feels like Kevin Durant is like, my God, look at all this stuff you guys did. It didn't pan out. You're a part of that. And I'm not throwing all the blame on him. This is what we've always said. Everybody has a share of this blame pie here. And it feels like Durant is trying to say that I did not play a role in where we now stand.
It does sound like that. In a little bit later in the episode, I'll get to another piece where I think I can stand by him or at least see where he's coming from on this. We'll get to that in a second. Just to talk about how the organization seems to have been, have made a lot of Kevin Durant, made moves. Like, not necessarily that he was dictating it, but it was clear that he, wanted a part in having Jordan play, and then with Atkinson being removed, that's never really been disputed. Just in terms of how that whole thing went. I mean, we thought we saw a pretty big endorsement of Nash as a coach to start, and that seemed like as a full organizational on board. Maybe you want to say that
Kevin
hasn't
Durant
gone the way.
Vocalized it as well. Like, he directly vocalized support for Steve Nash.
You are allowed to change your mind.
Yep.
You are allowed to change your mind over time. That's clear. We always advocate for updated process, and how things started need not be the way they end. And I'm all for that. It does sound a little funny about the direction, but it kind of it probably more stems from where you think the direction was lost. You know what I mean? And I think that is probably the key part to all this is at what point did Kevin Durant feel like the direction was just went off course? And it's hard to exactly know that. We'll never know. It's probably, a death by 1,000 paper cuts. There's probably lots of little things that happen. We know that things have just gone awry here in the last couple of years for sure. And sometimes even some of that bad luck stuff you can just start associating with the organization. Like if you already have some inklings that things are problematic, and then little other things just happen to go wrong, injuries, whether a player wanted to be there or not, things like that, you can start associating it all with the organization. It doesn't take much. Like as soon as those seeds of doubt creep in on anybody, basketball players, humans, whatever, you can start attaching all kinds of stuff to why you don't trust someone or something. And so I hear what you're saying, and I agree with you. It does sound really funny to come out this way, to feel like oftentimes the organization is sort of bent over backwards to make sure he was happy. But I can also point to stuff that it wouldn't be hard to look at and say, from his point of view, and say, like, what were you thinking here? This one's close for me. Real quick, before we get to that, though, I'll just bury this here. What would you do? What do you do now? Like this kind of, do you still try to stand pat? Like, do you, if you're Tsai and company, like, there's no way he fires Marks or Nash, right? Like, there's no way he acquiesces to a trade demand, whether right or wrong. Like,
I'll circle back to I'll circle back to the Kevin Durant, the blame game, however we want to talk about that. But to your point, no. Like, and this is again what I think is not weird about it. We've outlined why you bring it to the public forum. Okay, fine, but it's not like Joe Tsai. Nothing is different. Nothing is different from when you made the trade request to now. And nothing, I don't think, if you had conversations between Joe Tsai and Sean Marks, again, right, wrong, and different around what you think the organization or Joe Tsai should be doing. But if he already had those meetings and they've had those discussions, and Sean Marks, who, as we've said before, pre-superstars, built up the organization, right, reclamated the roster, did a lot of good things to get to this point to make them attractive. If Sean Marks went into a meeting with Joe Tsai and said, and here's the way that I'm going to restructure us once again and reclamate things, and we'll have Kyrie for this year. We'll get into that, I think, in a second here too. We're going to have Ben Simmons. We have young talent. This is my path forward. Nothing about that looks any different from Joe Tsai's perspective now that he's had a face-to-face meeting. And by the way, inside of the Shams Charania article, it said that the meeting was regarded as transparent and professional. So I'm not creating this narrative of Kevin Durant comes in throwing the tantrum. To your point, I think that, yes, there's plenty of talking points that we can say. And this is why Sean Marks was at fault. This is why Steve Nash is a bad coach. This is why Joe Tsai made mistakes, why the organization holds weight in this. We can do that with Kyrie Irving. We can do it with James Harden. We can do it with Kevin Durant. It's more just this idea that you somehow want to separate yourself from that, rather than if this came out and we heard it was an open and transparent conversation that essentially said, listen, we tried it. It didn't work out for whatever the reasons may be. And it's still in my best interest to part ways at this point. That's fine. Speculated this one, the precursor to the meeting rumored to occurring. And it was, I wonder if he's just going to expand his trade teams, right? Where is he willing to go? What is he willing to do in order to facilitate a trade? That could just as well have been an outcome. And it looks like this just feels like the more extreme version of this meeting, as opposed, and by the way, true to form for the Brooklyn Nets over the last 3 years, it usually ends up being the extreme version of something as opposed to what could be an amicable separation between superstar and team.
Yeah, I think that's totally the case. And it's like in some ways not really news, in some ways all the news, right? Like these are both things kind of combined all together. It's that this isn't really surprising. I think my only disappointment is I was hoping for something different, or I thought there was maybe fences to be mended. But this just, in terms of just bringing back, like having things snap back into focus, I think this is going to do a couple things. Well, let's save the Nash comments for the commentary for like next episode, because I think there's a whole discussion.
I'm not worried about his component in there at all.
But I think it will. Here's what I will say for the next episode. If you thought Nets fans were going to be divided about Nash, like this thing is like, that's the end of that. Any hope that you had about Nash as a coach or being able to like stay long-term viable, if they trade Durant, Nash will always be blamed. Marks too, but like if you already did not like Steve Nash, this is the end of it. There's no hope. There's no hope to go back. You'll never go back with Nash. I want to say something. Like, go ahead, because I think this deserves like a longer talking point about Nash.
Yeah, and we'll save that. But to the idea of what did this meeting do, or what did Shams Charania's article in The Athletic serve to do in terms of Nets fans, the fan base? It further entrenches you on what either side you were on. If you were, team Kevin Durant and they should be doing what's right to make him happy and to satisfy him, to keep him here, then this is only going to make you feel that much more bullish on it. And if you are on the organizational side of it, you're going to look at it and say, Well, I'm not speaking from that side necessarily, but it's going to be, hey, here's all the talking points that you can bat around and why it feels like it's a little more balanced on one side than not. Coming up here in a second, though, and we can touch back into whatever you want on that element. I also want to ask you a specific question when it comes to Kyrie Irving and his role in all of this and what that could mean going forward. Okay, so do you want to follow up with anything around the divide here? We're teasing about discussing a little more in depth Steve Nash and his role. I think you're right when it comes to Sean Marks. You can separate those two things because I don't think from a fan perspective, you disassociate to different levels. Ownership is disassociated at a certain level. GM is disassociated at a different level, and then head coach. And typically, one of the most replaceable commodities around superstars and what they prefer would be the head coach.
Yeah, and so like if you just weren't on Team Nash already, then you're totally done. We'll still talk about that later in the week.
Okay, so then
go ahead. What's your question? Yeah,
we talked about whether or not. So Kyrie Irving doesn't get the contract extension, and maybe that bothers Kevin Durant, and that's a part of it too. And that could be the component of the direction of the organization not being committed to him. But then in recent days, the Brooklyn Nets social media is posting things up around Kyrie. A lot of players are supporting Kyrie at his different events and occasions. It seems like this is where I think it gets weird. Unless I think it's weird that it looks like things are getting further apart with Kevin Durant, obviously. But the reclamation project of the relationship with Kyrie Irving seems to be getting better, at least right now in this moment. Do you think that there is also the Kyrie Irving element that is not getting mentioned in this article that Kevin Durant inside of this whole spectrum goes, and also whatever went on over these last couple of years, I hold Kyrie Irving also accountable, or I at least view Kyrie Irving in the spectrum of, can I win championships with him? Maybe that has changed as well. Something that we have talked about in recent weeks.
No, if anything, I think it's the opposite. I think it's like him. I can't imagine. I don't think him and Kyrie are at odds at all. That's not. I don't think that's the case.
Just like seeing him backstage with James Harden at a concert, and it looks like
there's no evidence. There's no evidence that
players never are.
Well, there is some evidence that the Simmons thing that we talked about before was correct, by the way. And we can talk about that later in the week too, because there was a little bit of tidbits of news that came out around how the players might have thought about Simmons. But in terms of Kyrie, I think if anything, it's more realistic to me that Kyrie's told him, he's like, I'm never resigning here. Like after this year, I'm not coming back. I'll go anywhere else. Like, and so that, or they just said, hey, this is how these guys roll. They played a lot in the NBA together. They played a lot not with each other. They did it for a little bit. And I don't think these guys care about this as much as people think. I do think though, and this is again, something we were going to talk about in another episode. I've done 5 teases here. I do think if you trace some of this back though, like what you mentioned before about signing the extension preseason last year, like I wonder if that is actually the part that he's referring to, is like, I was supposed to be locked up long-term with Kyrie and Harden, and that's just not the case. And that's the direction. Like, because if anything, if he felt that way about the organizational direction, then it is totally reasonable to see that the organization is going off the rails in a way, by the way, in a way that can't be corrected, because Harden's already gone. And it doesn't look like they want to sign Kyrie. So I do wonder if like that, among other things, maybe Simmons, maybe some of this other stuff, like is part of the direction. And if that is, it's not correctable, except to fire the people that did it. And I don't think he ever wants that. Because he knows it's not going to happen. He just wants to be traded.
Well, by the way, so here's a big part of it. And I think, so as I say, everyone has their blame in this pie. And Sean Marks said, probably a mistake to have come out and said it's just a matter of when, not if, everyone gets brought back on their extensions. Now, once you made that choice at that point, you had to then fully commit to at whatever cost, right? You can't enter negotiations at any point with Kyrie and say, we'd like to have stipulations in there, or James Harden, we really love you, but not at max dollars, whatever it may have looked like, right? At that point, you had to say it's everybody for all the money, and this is what we're going forward with. So that is a huge mistake at that point for this organization, that you fumbled it. You made a huge error. And if that was the start of the divide for Kevin Durant, then I think you're right. Like at that point, everything after that becomes, here's another red flag. Here's something else I don't like. And that can include, regardless of what Ben Simmons is as a player, just saying, I didn't say that I want to come here to play with Ben Simmons. I want to come here to play with Kyrie. And then ultimately, I also wanted James Harden to get here to play with him. And none of that's going to happen. And that's why there is you could fire Sean, by the way, you could fire Sean Marks and you can fire Steve Nash and Kevin Durant could still say that he doesn't want to be here anymore, right? Like that, I think, is the other part of this. And I asked you that question around Kyrie, almost to the point of when we talk about how, what did we think was going to happen? I didn't think that Kevin Durant was going to be a Brooklyn Net this year. I don't think, you mentioned it, I don't think that Kyrie Irving is necessarily going to be a long-term Brooklyn Net. And I think organizationally, I went back to this, when the trade request happened from James Harden, that is organization, Sean Marks to Joe Tsai probably had private conversations and said, this is what it looks like now. It's starting to fall apart, and it's only going to get worse from here. Are you ready to accept how bad it could get for us? And all the way back then, in that moment of the trade request from James Harden, I think was the beginning of the end for this superstar team and saving any version of it, because you cannot correct it once that happens.
Yeah, and again, the list is so long with things that have gone wrong here. There's been lots of misreads along the way. We've mentioned this many times. And really quick, later in the week when we talk about two things we would have changed over this timeline, they're both at an organizational level. Even though I've praised the organization, because I think by and large they've done a lot of things correct and have had a lot of bad luck get in their way. But they have had a bunch of misreads along the way here, and unfortunately, while I think they've done just about everything really well on kind of all levels, the places where they've screwed up have been so bad that it kind of undoes
affecting.
It screws up. And it doesn't take much when that's concerned. Like, you can do a lot of things right around trust and all this stuff. It doesn't take much to break it down. It takes almost nothing. And so, like, I think that when we look back at this, while again, I've been very complimentary of the Marks part of it, I think we've still left the Steve Nash. I mean, we've been in Steve Nash's corner a little bit. It's kind of hard to even look at the resume and be like so bullish on it, but I still think there's like a lot of TBD stuff on him. But that's hard to make because he's been a coach for a while now. But I think I hold both things to be true. Is that I think by and large the Marks regime has done really, really well in terms of the moves they made. They've been really thoughtful, and they've made at the time what I thought were a lot of right moves, but there have been places where they've just have completely misread the situation. And this is definitely one of them.
Yeah. And if you feel like I've been beating up Kevin Durant in this episode, wait until we get to the organizational one, because I'll lay it out. And by the way, a lot of it has to do with remember, culture, that big word that got thrown around for the Brooklyn Nets leading up to attracting superstars. If that is a component of your identity, then there has to be a level of commitment to that. And that's where I think the organization and Sean Marks also had big failings along the way. What the one part about the Shams Charania article for The Athletic, though, that I think is also worth noting. So when it came down to it, we know still remains intact as far as where the trade market stands. The Raptors, Miami Heat, and the Celtics are considered to still be remaining significant candidates to acquire Kevin Durant, the sources said here, and the package centering obviously around Jaylen Brown from the Celtics also included the footnote that Kevin Durant was close with Ime Udoka, or felt like that relationship was growing over his time, which could be an attractive component to it. We'll delve into later what that maybe should have meant organizationally for the Brooklyn Nets when we talk about possible mistakes. But you said it doesn't impact the way the trade market goes here. Does this make it get done sooner? As opposed to if we thought about, all right, maybe he's going to sit out training camp. If that feels inevitable to me, him staying away from the team now is almost all but guaranteed. Like, I don't see why he would come back and be around training camp or be around anything to do with the season, regardless of whether or not a trade feels like it's imminently materializing, because it's clearly, I'm going to show up and play underneath Steve Nash to start the season. There's no world where that happens. Do you think that this pushes it to happen sooner?
I do think it's hilarious to think about a GM. I tweeted this out, but I do think it's hilarious to think about a GM trading for Kevin Durant, only to have Kevin Durant then immediately go to the owner and tell that owner of that team that it's him or the GM, which is basically what he's doing with Marks right here. Like, so like the GM could trade himself right into the same situation as Marks. I mean, you still always trade for Kevin Durant because it's never going to be you, right? It's always going to be the other guy that the bad thing happens to. So that's another human nature. I actually don't think this changes too much with the way the Nets view it. I think I think they already knew this was to be the case. So I think if we work under the assumption that they already knew this was the case, I actually don't think this changes that much. I think they'd be willing to just say, sit out then. Like, I just think, like, if you're going to take the Daryl Morey tact with this, like, if you're going to take the Daryl Morey with Ben Simmons, which is like, you don't want to play? Cool, don't play. You're going to get fined for not being here. And like, I don't think Durant cares about that, but you're going to be fine for not being there. And we're just going to wait till someone good enough comes along and we get a package that we like. The Nets probably should still take that tact, because there's just too much on the line. It's just too much of an organizational death knell to take a package that's not worth it. So I, from that standpoint, don't think that it changes that much there. It just changes whether my bullishness around this coming back, which has now been eroded. But other than that, I still think that I don't think they should just trade him for 25 cents on the dollar because
because
he doesn't
ugly.
like Marks. Right. Yeah, because it's just like this was always going to happen, I think.
Okay, then last thing here, because we almost didn't kind of say it here, and we're going to cover this more throughout the week and throughout the weeks, but should Joe Tsai, do you think, understanding where they stood coming into this, and it was already that they organizationally had made their stand, should they be firing Sean Marks and Steve Nash to keep Kevin Durant happy? Should any team be willing to do that in circumstances like this?
No, I don't think so, because I think what would happen is, even if you thought you really wanted to, and with Kevin Durant, you should at least have a meeting about it, not with Sean Marks himself, but with
Sean Marks. But now, come on in, Sean. You and I, Sean, need to have a discussion about you.
The reason you can't do it is because everyone that comes after Sean Marks, you'll never be able to hire anyone of merit, because they'll always look and say, I'm one superstar from being fired. And
Joe Tsai's the owner, so he's always going to have that mentality.
Exactly. And I think from that standpoint, that's really frankly why you can't fire the coach either. Even though everyone knows that about the coaches, everyone knows that if the superstars don't like the coach gets fired. It's usually not expressly said. Like Vogel just got fired, right? Was the Lakers his fault? No. Coaches are the punching bags usually, or the whipping people for when eventually you just get the organization goes bad, the coach is the last move, you fire the coach. I think in this case they won't do it because it's so public now that you really would have a problem hiring anybody of merit going forward, knowing that they're just going to be, you're one situation away from, one superstar away from being fired yourself. So I do not think they should. And it sucks because Kevin Durant's one of the few guys you think about it for, because he's just so good. He's just so good. There's so few of these guys, but you can't do it. It's too much of an organizational, sort of organizational malpractice in your ability to do things later. And so, because no one will ever take you seriously again.
And this is the thing where I think if you were going to go this route, it would have been Sean Marks built up the organization to be attractive, and then he was let go before Joe Tsai executed with a new GM, the signing of Kyrie Irving, the signing of Kevin Durant, right? And then you move forward with this lockstep. Once you have someone that's built up to this process, just to your point, we came through this, we're committed to our structure. And if I bail on it now, who's ever going to look at this? By the way, in a team that is in a major market, but we always say battles to be a major market team, you're going to really fight an uphill battle, unlike organizations like the Lakers or the Knicks, who seem to be Teflon in terms of staying attractive, staying viable for a fan base, etc. So all of those components play a big factor. I know it's not a fun thing to hear from a fan's perspective. I wish this wasn't the case, but I do feel at least I feel painfully good that I felt like this is where this was going to end up, and why I kind of said all along, I wish they would just resolve it sooner than later, because this feels, you said at some point in this episode, by 1,000 paper cuts. I keep getting cut. You just keep giving me more paper cuts, and it doesn't look like it's just going to be one more and then it's over. There's going to be a few hundred more before this gets done.
Yeah, it's just again, in the Nets offseason, you plan one episode and then it takes about 5 seconds for that to be completely undone, because we had a whole other plan. Although this really actually does tie into a lot of what we were going to talk about already. It's actually to the point where Adam and I were like, shoot, I wish this had happened on Friday, because we had two podcasts where we mentioned some stuff here that tied in perfectly to this. We just got kind of screwed a little bit with the timing. Anyway, thanks a lot. Thanks for nothing.
Thanks a lot, Shams.
couldn't have buried that for another week. We're only in August. All right, we're gonna get out of here. Make sure you subscribe to the podcast. Appreciate all the comments. Got into it with some commenters there over on YouTube. Got opinions? We'll fire some opinions back and forth. Love the comments over on YouTube. Definitely leave them. Trying to respond to everything. And make sure you subscribe to YouTube as well.
I am happy. I'm happy. I'm a happy person. I'm happy with my life. I'm happy with the way things are going in my life. I'm happy with I don't know. It's Bill Pullman from Twister.
Oh, one of the all-time great poets. R.I.P.
Bill Paxton. Bill Paxton.
I was gonna say Bill. Well, he's definitely R.I.P. I just couldn't remember if his character went R.I.P. in that movie too. Yeah. Anyway, one of the all-time great poets. We will be back again tomorrow talking more Brooklyn Nets basketball.